We are very excited for our penultimate presentation at this year's Disability Summit from the Maryland Initiative for Disability Accessibility. As a reminder, all of our sessions are being recorded, and if you choose to stay, that implies consent to being recorded. We have ASL interpreters as well as CART and Zoom live transcription for accessibility. I will now turn it over to Dr. Jonathan Lazar to introduce his panel and kick us off. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Lazar. I'm a professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, and I am thrilled to be presenting today with my colleagues, Paul Jaeger and Palla, to be presenting about this exciting new initiative at the University of Maryland called the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility, or for shorthand, MIDA. So we're going to start with Palla, who's going to start presenting. I'll then present, and then Paul will come in and present later. So we look forward to having you join us in MIDA. And let me mention, I know that some of you will be consuming this presentation at a later time because it'll be recorded. Even at a later time, we will still look forward to connecting with you and to your future participation in MIDA. So Anna, please take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for being with us here today. My name is Palla, and I work as a senior IT accessibility and UX specialist at the University of Maryland in College Park at the Division of IT. I'm a white woman with short hair, and I use she and her pronouns, and I always like saying that my accent is from Brazil. And let's get started, Jonathan, with this question, right? Like, why is digital accessibility important? Why do we care so much about it? And why we should be considering, all these different products and tools and all the digital content that we all consume today? Why digital accessibility is so important? When we think about that, a simple answer would be that we cannot live without technology today. I think all of us here, including the Zoom call right now, we cannot live without that, without the use of technology. We all rely on it, we depend on it, we are required to use technology today. Let's go to the next slide. So when we look at this data, and today, we have a world population of almost 8 billion people. And we have 57% of people living in urban areas. From the 8 billion people, 5.31 billion, which is 67% of the population, are unique mobile device users. When we look at the number of internet users, there are 4.95 billion internet users, which is about 62.5% of the population. And then when we look at social media, there is 4.62 billion people in the world, about 58.4% of the world population being active social media users. So we can just make an assertion of that, when we think about the majority of the population really today relies on technology to live their lives. Let's go to the next. So I invite you just to think for a moment and pause and just to look through your life and think about your daily activities at home, at work, the things that you do for your hobbies, your studies, the way how you communicate with people, the kinds of devices that you use, and begin to think about like how much do you rely on technology. When I look at my day, I realize that some days I spend more than 10 hours, probably way more than that, using technology, especially the days that I'm all day at work, and I daily use multiple devices and I interact with different softwares and different websites through different devices as well. I use different apps, websites for my personal use, for work. I also manage many things for my family. I have a daughter that is 8. So for example, this past months, I signed up my daughter for camps and classes. I also bought a train ticket, airplane ticket, booked hotel, bought different kinds of foods, made reservations, did a lot of banking, paid bills. I managed my insurance. I schedule a doctor's appointment. We sign contracts, sign up for this conference. I'm attending this conference. I'm attending also trainings. And for work, it's interesting, right? Because all those things that we do in our, our life, a lot of times those things are our choices, and they give, so many different opportunities for all of us to interact with people from all over the world, especially like when you think about the social media usage and how we learn so many things, we can do business through that. There's like a wide variety of ways to interact with that. But then when we think about work and education, right, where a lot of times we get inside the organization and there are several platforms that I am required to use as part of my job. From the day that I apply for the job, from the interview process and the way how people communicated with me, the HR, now that I have the job, right, the sign off of timesheets, the PRDs. I use a ServiceNow ticketing system, as an instructor as well, because I also teach. I use the Elms Canvas learning management system, and which also has many distinct tools that are part of, they are integrated with the system. I use many video platforms such as Panopto, YouTube, in the Zoom conference rooms and so forth. So there are so many opportunities in the digital environment that I rely and I depend on, and I have that as a requirement for me, right? And, for so many instances in my job at the university, and when they're interacting with people at the university and different locations, we begin to realize of how many of all these different technologies that we all rely on, that we are, required to use, that our students are required to use, that we are, if we want to buy a pizza that we need to use, anything that we want to use today, how many of all these technologies, many times they are not built accessible. So let's go to the next slide, Jonathan. So there's so many challenges and barriers with inaccessible technologies. And there are so many barriers and inequalities for people with disabilities, especially those who use assistive technologies such as screen readers, magnifiers, people who use technologies such as text-to-speech technology, speech-to-text, those who cannot use a mouse, and so forth. So when we think about inaccessible digital technologies, they really represent barriers for inclusion and equal participation, and so many in all areas of life today. And here we included, education, health, employment, commerce, civil engagement, until the moment that that technology is remediated and made accessible. Let's go to the next. And so many times these technologies are never made accessible because of so many reasons, because of the cost, because it's not feasible, because nobody requested. So when this technology is retrofitted for accessibility as well, a lot of times the solutions are inelegant and they're also a lot more expensive. And we always need to consider that it might take months or weeks to have a new version of an app to be launched with a new version that is accessible, or for a software to be made accessible. So you think about during the time that these technologies are being retrofitted for accessibility, people with disabilities do not have access to them. In the same way how people without disabilities might have access. And this is a form of discrimination. All the barriers in the digital environment is a form of discrimination. And if you have been following the news, and if you are someone who rely, who use adaptive technology, have experienced some of the barriers, maybe you have even made a complaint. The number of complaints and lawsuits around digital accessibility have grown tremendously because people have been denied access to a lot of services, to a lot of the same opportunities that people without disabilities have been having. So this is one of the first biggest whys, like why is this important? The second thing is, John, let's go to the next one. Just to demonstrate the fact that most people can really benefit from accessible technology. We have an image here, a black-white image of the University of Maryland football stadium with 100% capacity, full of people in the stands. So if we think of a concept that we can remember, right, that is essential, which is the experience that people have that when we bring accessibility to a physical space, such as ramps, curb cuts, elevators, most people can also benefit from those, right? But with digital accessibility is exactly the same. We do have a percentage of the population, about 26% of people in the US, who have a disability. You can go to the next, Jonathan. Have a disability, and all those people, and now here we have 26% of the stadium, being colored in red, representing this 26% of the people who have a disability. Many of them require the technology to be accessible and might be excluded if the technology is not accessible. Then you have another 57% of the people without disabilities that can benefit from accessible technology and different accessibility features and tools. And when we combine those two groups, we get that most people could benefit from accessible technology. And when we think about digital accessibility tools and features, such as color contrast, actually good color contrast and use of color, captioning, us having the choice and the ability to hear text out loud, which we call the technology text-to-speech. When we have a choice within a technology to dictate instead of typing a text in an email, you're using a speech-to-text assistive technology. When you use your phone features to magnify a screen, to read text out loud, or using an accessibility tool or feature within your phone to change color contrast, for example. But a lot of those tools and features, they will only work if the app of software website was created in such a way to allow that technology to be integrated from that. And it is important that that technology is built in that way so that can be accessible from the beginning and doesn't need to be retrofitted. Let's go to the next slide, Jonathan. So the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility brings to the forefront the concept of born accessible technology. So accessibility is built in the initial design of any new software, app, website, document, any kind of digital content. So then the born accessible digital technology is going to really ensure equal access. So people with disabilities, their family, friends, they can perceive the technology, they can understand, and they can operate the technology with or without the use of assistive technology independently. So when we look at the benefits of born accessible technologies, let's push the next. They really ensure that people with disabilities have equal access with no need for retrofit or implement accommodations. There is also low cost or no additional cost when including accessibility from the beginning. We have a best user experience for everyone. And there is also a change in values and culture where we are really considering accessibility as an essential part of design versus something that we have to do because we receive a request or because it's after the fact. So it's inclusive. And another important thing is that drives innovation. When we have a lot of people really trying to come up with solutions to make sure that all the technologies, and now we got to really begin to expand the thinking innovation as we have, the virtual reality tools, the metaverse, and so forth, all as we begin to expand, all the digital technologies. So I'm so grateful to be part of MIDA. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan so he can share with you about the objectives and all the great initiatives that MIDA is bringing.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna. My name is Jonathan Lazar. I am a Caucasian male, about average height. I'm wearing a navy jacket, a blue and white striped shirt, and a red tie. Before the pandemic, my hair was completely brown, but now it's mostly gray. So I am thrilled to be here again with all of you today to talk to you about the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. And the core goal of MIDA, as we call it, and again, MIDA received funding from the University of Maryland Grand Challenges program and from Adobe. And they funded us because our core goal is to make digital technologies and content born accessible. And how are we going to do that? We are going to bring together a wide range of people on the University of Maryland campus. We're going to connect with a lot of external partners, organizational partners. We're going to work not only on research, but on research and development, on education, on community engagement and advocacy, right? Best practices. What we're trying to do is do essentially a full stack institute on digital accessibility, where we're involved with all the different angles. We're involved in policy and law. We're involved with research. We're involved with development. We're involved with education. We're involved because we want to see this goal of born accessible technologies. And the way to do that is by partnering with everyone. Now, some of you may have heard of the Trace Center. Now, the Trace Research and Development Center was founded in 1971 by Greg Vanderheiden at the University of Wisconsin. And the Trace Center moved to the University of Maryland in 2016. And I became director of the Trace Center in 2021. And we have 4 images on the screen, and I'm going to describe each one. So the Trace Center was really involved in the early history of digital technologies and AAC, augmentative and alternative communication. And Trace really started because there were no companies that were focusing much on these areas, and there was a need. And if you read about the history of the Trace Center, there's a new book out about the 50 years of the Trace Center. You'll be able to read about the story of the student on the left, Lydell, a student with cerebral palsy, and there was no way for him to communicate, right? And so basically an AAC device was built, one of the first, by Greg and the Trace Center team. And that's the picture on the left. The picture in the middle is Greg showing voting machine accessibility features to, at the time, President Bill Clinton and Vice President Al Gore. And so Trace has been involved with voting accessibility. The image on the right is that of a kiosk for ticketing at an Amtrak station. So if you've ever been to an Amtrak rail station where they have a kiosk, you will note that there is often a keypad that says easy access. And that's a Trace Center developed device and the approaches and software that go with it. So you'll find those at Amtrak kiosks. You'll find them at airport kiosks. You will also find them if you're coming back into the US. You will find them at Customs and Border Patrol, where the kiosks very frequently have the easy access features. However, one warning to you: if you get really excited that there's a Trace Center technology and you pull out your phone and go to take a picture of it while you're in the Customs and Border Patrol area, they might arrest you or threaten to arrest you. I'm not saying that this happened to me personally, but it might have happened to me personally. So if you get excited, if you're in Customs, don't pull out your phone to take a picture of it. The icon on the bottom, it's not a picture, it's an icon of Morphic, the auto personalization software that's available in a lot of libraries, and you can go to morphic.org to read more about it, but it's in wide use across the country. I also want to mention one thing that probably most of you are familiar with, and that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You sometimes hear of them called WCAG, right? And the Web Content Accessibility Guideline is the international technical standard for web accessibility. So it first was introduced by the Web Accessibility Initiative in 1999, was upgraded to version 2.0 in 2008, recently upgraded to version 2.1 and 2.2. And that set of technical standards is the foundation for many of the laws, many of the, I should say, the statutes, the regulations, the case law around the world related to digital accessibility. Now, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, actually started life as the Trace Center Unified Web Access Guidelines. And those were published, and those served as the starting point for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So if you've ever heard of or used WCAG, right, that also started at the Trace Center. So Trace has a great history over 50 years of real innovations related to accessibility and assistive technology and augmentative and alternative communication. So the Trace Center is growing into MIDA. So all the things that you like about the Trace Center, the work on kiosks, the work on standards, those will still be going on. But MIDA is actually much bigger because Trace focused primarily on building things. And it was just on building things and building great technologies, which luckily were tech transferred and were adopted. But all of that will continue, but MIDA is much larger. It's going to include a lot of different disciplines of people, right? All the different angles of education and engineering and speech and advocacy and policy and law. And there's so much. We have so much expertise on the University of Maryland campus. We have so many people who are passionate about accessibility. And MIDA is designed to connect all those people and build something bigger, to build a strong community of people who are passionate about digital accessibility, to get that synergy. Now, I want to mention that the first keynote at the first Disability Summit was actually about the history of the Trace Center. So the Trace Center has been partnering with the Disability Summit and involved for a number of years. And Paul will tell you a little bit more later about how the Disability Summit will relate and how to get involved. You know, our goal with Born Accessible Technologies is to really change the model of how technology is built. Because what we want to do is ensure that at the beginning, disability rights communities are included, people with disabilities are included. We want to make sure that, for instance, education incorporates digital accessibility. And the Born Accessible way of doing that is not to teach accessibility as the last class before you graduate, as many universities do. Because think about it. If you teach everything about technology design, then at the end you teach accessibility right before you graduate, people are going to assume that, well, the way you do it is you build the technology and then you retrofit it for accessibility. No, we want to change the model by incorporating accessibility concepts earlier on in any type of technical, right, or design or education. So we want to make sure that we involve disability community, we involve tech companies. We want to shift the model so that, as Anna talked about earlier, born accessible technologies save money. Often you hear people saying, well, accessibility is expensive. Well, yeah, I mean, if you think about it using the house model, if you build a house and then you say, oh, let's make it accessible. So then you have to go in and you have to widen the doorways so wheelchair users can fit through, and you have to change the turnaround radius in the bathroom. You have to change, right? Yeah, that's going to be expensive, possibly. However, if you build a house from scratch to be accessible, right, it's not expensive. It may cost close to zero. Same thing is true of software. Retrofitting is really the wrong way to build accessibility in software. We have a lot of things we need to retrofit, but we'd rather start from scratch and make born accessible technologies because it leads to better design, right? It leads to accessibility that is either very inexpensive or the cost approach is zero, right? Born accessible is the way to do it. And digital accessibility has really changed in many ways over time. So, you know, obviously one of the most obvious ones would be just the change from the pandemic, where a lot of things that could be done in person or online went to strictly online. And so there was no in-person accommodation. If the technology was not, right, accessible, you were completely barred from taking part in every aspect of life. So we've got, first of all, the COVID shift, right? Second of all, you know, we want to move from remediation to born accessible because we know remediation is expensive, and that's where you get much more pushback on accessibility. It used to be that designers and researchers built technologies and then brought in people with disabilities at the end to, right, to test, to evaluate. That's not the right way to do it. You want to have people with disabilities become co-designers. You want to bring them in at the beginning. When the Trace Center first started over 50 years ago, a lot of technologies that were built at Trace were then tech transferred to large tech companies. And that's, you see a lot of, you know, the basic accessibility features in like iOS and Windows and DOS and Linux. Actually, a lot of those accessibility features originated at the Trace Center. However, that model doesn't work well anymore because most technology companies, large technology companies, now have their own accessibility staff. So the model of we'll build it and we'll hand it off to a company doesn't really work anymore because the companies have their own accessibility staff. And so what we want to do is partner with them. We want to collaborate with them. And also, think about where Trace started 50 years plus years ago, 1971. The ADA did not exist yet. The Rehab Act of 1973 didn't exist yet. IDEA did not exist yet. So all the laws that we think of to protect the rights of people with disabilities didn't exist, except for the Architectural Barriers Act. That one predated the Trace Center. So you really now want to emphasize, right, the importance of policy and law and making sure that we're working with policymakers to make sure that policies and technologies actually sync up, so that the policies make sense given the existing technologies, and that good science and research actually informs the policies. So MIDA was created to address these different shifts and to help build a community of passionate people. Here's an example in terms of the policy and law angles. Now I say this is really more of an issue now. There are two relatively new statutes in the state of Maryland. One requiring access to digital technologies for students with disabilities in K-12 environment, right? And then the non-visual access clause for IT procurement for the state of Maryland. Both of them focus on accessible technologies, whether we're talking about software, operating systems, right? Hardware, right? Web content, whatever. The idea is that there are hard requirements in there, and that brings attention to people doing procurement, people working at universities, people working in the K-12 environment, that Maryland statutes have strong requirements now for digital accessibility. I'm honored I was able to be involved in writing the text of both statutes, and so that was a real honor, and I'm thrilled to have that type of impact. It's important to note that there are two federal changes coming potentially soon. So in the last Congress, the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act was introduced, and it's probably going to be reintroduced in this Congress. And it's an act to clarify the requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Because right now, right, you are required, if you're a public accommodation covered under the ADA, you're required to have an accessible website. However, the regulations don't really give you enough guidance. And so from a legal point of view, it's clear based on case law and based on what the DOJ has said. But for a lot of people, they struggle with understanding what the requirements are and how to meet them. And so the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act would clarify those requirements. There's also a rulemaking process for web accessibility for Title II of the ADA. Title II deals with state and local government. And that rulemaking process, which had been put on hold a number of years ago, is starting again. The DOJ has said they're also going to clarify the requirements because organizations, state and local government, or as in the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act, public accommodations, they want feedback and clarity. And so there's a lot of activity right now in policy and law related to digital accessibility. So what are our 5 goals for the future for MIDA? First, our goal is to build a community of faculty, staff, and students at the university who are passionate about digital accessibility. Paul will tell you more about the community of people. There's 38 of them. Second, we want to actively engage with external stakeholders. So we are planning right now an industry advisory board, a tech industry advisory board, as well as a disability rights advisory board. And we're currently working with policymakers at the state and federal level. We are going to do 2 demonstration projects to demonstrate the impact and the ease of born accessible technologies, of using the born accessible approach. We're going to be working with, again, the disability rights groups, our external stakeholders, the tech companies. Goal 4, we want to submit a lot of funding proposals. We're going to have a set of working groups within MIDA focusing on different aspects of digital accessibility, and each faculty member will be part of a working group, and those working groups are going to submit funding proposals. And we're also going to hold events on the University of Maryland campus related to digital accessibility because we want to increase digital awareness. We want to increase, awareness of digital accessibility right at the University of Maryland, and we expect many of those will be available online as well. So we'll be able to spread that message to the broader world. So right now we have 6 faculty members who are on the leadership team of MIDA. I'm Jonathan Lazar. Again, I'm the executive director of MIDA. We've got my colleagues who are co-presenting with me, Paul Jaeger and Anna Palla. We've also got on the leadership team, Baron Jordan, Amanda Lazar, no relationship to me, and Golnoza Yakubova. So that's on the leadership team. And now I'm going to pass it over to Paul to tell you more about how MIDA relates to the summit and more about our campus collaborations. Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm Paul Jaeger, he, him, a professor at the University of Maryland and the co-founder, co-chair of the summit you're currently attending. As Jonathan has mentioned, there have been some pretty significant previous interactions between TRACE and the summit. But these connections are going to be much closer going forward, both conceptually and operationally, with the advent of MIDA. The primary goal of MIDA parallels the primary goal we had starting the summit. That is, bringing together disparate aspects of disability that should be working in conjunction, but historically have not. So with the summit, the goal of bridging differences between fields and disabilities and locations was the starting point, and it was a new approach to gathering around disability. MIDA extends that idea further to bring together research, education, engagement, advocacy, community building, and best practices related to disability into one entity. By bringing all these elements and experts together across pretty much most of the disciplines invested in disability, MIDA will be able to make an impact in multiple spaces simultaneously. So, for example, new research discoveries or inventions can fairly immediately be turned into educational and advocacy materials and sent out to the various communities as new ideas, new things to try. And the Including Disability Global Summit and the accompanying Including Disability Journal will be part of this, both in terms of being part of these communication and dissemination mechanisms of what MIDA does, and a place for people to talk about ideas related to these innovations, but also these will be administratively part of MIDA, which, just for those of us who run the summit, is really exciting because this is going to be the first time we have a permanent home, which will be very nice. So MIDA, as Jonathan mentioned, has a pretty huge interdisciplinary cast of researchers from a lot of spaces already. And so even though it isn't an actual academic department, it is basically like an accessibility studies department. The campus map here shows 38 partners on campus who represent a dozen different units. So the first, you see it as a map, and then on the next slide, it's a list of people. These are both ways of showing not only the number of people immediately at Maryland who are experts in accessibility that can be pulled together to start this adventure. It also shows just the potential for its growth. This is so far only people at the University of Maryland. As we administratively launch, as we operationally launch, we're going to have the opportunity to expand involvement beyond campus. So we're going to start being able to bring in people working in all of these areas and others from all over the place, hopefully including some of you who are listening right now. And we also have a really amazing set of partnerships with non-governmental organizations and corporations. These are going to amplify the impacts of what we all do at MIDA in spaces that academic research and educational initiatives have usually had a very difficult time reaching. So MIDA is going to be an unprecedented connection point between all these different entities that are going to hopefully present unprecedented opportunities to improve accessibility and overall equity for disabled people. As I mentioned, we've got a lot of non-governmental organizations, educational advocacy groups that are partners from national, state, and regional levels. I'm not going to read the whole list, but these include NFB, NAD, Easter Seals, Gallaudet, Maryland Department of Disabilities, Maryland Library for the Blind and Print Disabled. It's a really amazing group of entities that have joined with us to get this started. And we also have some pretty amazing corporate partners as well. On this slide, Meta, Adobe, Microsoft are going to be familiar names and very significant familiar names. The fourth name, Vespero, may not be familiar, but it's a prominent maker of accessibility technologies. And it may be that many people attending the summit right now are using some of their inventions and products without even realizing the name of the company. So with all of these different entities from all these different spaces working together, we have a pretty unique set of strengths in establishing this. Bringing together expertise in advocacy, law, policy, education, industry, technology development, technology transfer, human rights, civil rights, communication and dissemination. All related to disability, all working together. And we also have the international community that has developed around the summit and the journal and our community list that can be part of this as well. So, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, we are able to build this new entity thanks to very generous foundational funding from the UMD Grand Challenges program and from Adobe. And we are enormously grateful for that. MIDA is going to start administratively becoming real on May 1st. So it's kind of funny to mention this at the end, but this is really kind of like our first introduction of MIDA to the world. Doing it at the Disability Summit, there couldn't be a better space to say, hey, this is a new thing we're trying. And so we will have an announcement about the website for MIDA late May, early June, somewhere in there. We will make sure to disseminate that so that people who are interested in learning more can do so that people who want to get involved can reach out. In the interim, if you are interested in talking about MIDA, we've got up Jonathan's email right now. Once we have the site up in a month or so, then we'll have a more formalized contact and listserv and things. But there's also information here about the summit or the journal. If you want to get involved or ask anything about those or use them as a pathway to trying to get more information about MIDA, we will, and we will do our best to answer your questions. So thank you very much for listening, and we really do look forward to working with a lot of you in the future as part of MIDA.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. And as Paul mentioned, MIDA officially administratively starts on May 1st. So we're working on a lot of things to get, kind of get off the ground in the next month or two, including the website. I'll mention if you want to get involved with MIDA, if you want to know more about MIDA, please email me at jlazar@umd.edu. And as Paul mentioned, there are also links. Disability, if you want to volunteer and get involved with the Disability Summit, that's Disability Summit-committee@umd.edu. If you want to get involved in the journal, including disabilityjournal@gmail.com. And certainly both the summit and the journal already have existing websites. So thank you all for your time. And Sarah, do we have time for some questions?
We do. We've got about 8 minutes and we've got a handful of questions. The first one was a reference to Josh Boyes, who's an architect, that discusses, how disability really is a starting point for creativity and a starting point for architecture. And the question was, are these types of concepts being incorporated into MIDA's Born Accessible endeavors? And if you don't know who Josh Boyes is, there are links and I can forward them after the fact.
Please, yeah, forward them after the fact. I'll say, actually, as I'd mentioned, the Architectural Barriers Act came before a lot of the other disability rights laws. And so in many ways, architecture serves as the historical foundation for accessibility. For some of the concepts, as I mentioned, every time that we try to explain what the Born Accessible approach is, We use architectural examples. I know Anna mentioned about the curb cut example. So a lot of our sort of foundational concepts do come from architecture, yes. But please forward the email and contact info to me. I would love to follow up with that individual.
Great, thank you. The next question was a little bit more pointed. We have somebody that teaches in a vocational school and uses H5P programming quite a bit, and finds that the screen readers don't work. It's very difficult to create accessible interactive content. And so wondering sort of how MIDA will reach out to different organizations, especially large ones in the educational environment, and where you pull information about sort of the next step to support or develop accessible software and programming.
I have actually two suggestions there. First of all, there is, if you look at the existing Trace website, there's information like there is a list, the master list that has a lot about existing accessible technologies. Also, I'll mention if the person is interested in programming, is it that they teach programming and want to teach programming in an accessible way?
So can I just—
Yeah, go for it, Anna, please.
So the H5P is software that is used by instructional designers to create interactive content. Like, let's say that I'm creating a course, I can create different questions and interactive content for that. What my understanding, and I have a little bit of knowledge about the tool. We did not have anybody at the university implementing this tool, but I have a look at their documentation before. So I'm going to post here in the chat, and I'm sure Amy is the one who answered the question. I don't know if you've seen the documentation that lists all the types of content and types of questionings and questions that you can include. They are accessible, and they already marked the ones who are not accessible. A couple suggestions that I have is that you reach out to them directly and request them to make accessible the ones that you identified that are not screen reader accessible based on your experience and with your students. And that before you renew your contract, that you make the request even more. And Jonathan, you can pitch into this right now, and I think that that's the moment that I find that we can make the biggest difference with companies. And I think Jonathan, you can also speak more about how MIDA strengthen and educate people on how to better advocate for this. But like, it's really is going to depend on each one of us as consumers of digital technology, and learning technologies is one of them. Right, this is a learning technology in some ways, design, that before you buy it, you make sure that you ensure that it's accessible. And if it is not, that you really hold the company accountable to make that accessible, that they have a roadmap and so forth. So I'm going to put here on the chat some of the notes about what I just said, Amy.
Thank you.
And I hope this is helpful.
Absolutely.
Jonathan, if you want to complement a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll add just a little bit on that, which is that anytime that you are doing any type of procurement, always put in indemnification clauses, which is that anytime you're procuring any type of technology, require that it's accessible, and say that the vendor must indemnify you, so that if your organization gets sued because your technology is not accessible, the vendor is the one on the hook. That's what an indemnification clause says. Those are really powerful tools, and a vendor who really knows about accessibility will say, that's fine, we're accessible. A vendor who's really not being exactly truthful when it comes to accessibility will say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about here? So let me also mention, anyone teaching any programming concepts, you might want to look at Quorum, which is an accessible programming language, right? That's used by a lot of, for instance, schools for the blind to teach programming concepts. So it's Quorum. If someone can find the link and put it in, the Quorum programming language, Quorum, I think it is.
I'm posting here on the chat as well. The University of Maryland, we developed this IT accessibility contract addendum that we make a recommendation for our procurement office to use when we are procuring any new technology. And Jonathan, we worked together, at the time, to come up with this language. And I know, if you remember, you reviewed this language was several years ago. So I'm going to put the link here on the chat. And we do have a website that is itaccessibility.umd.edu with a lot of information. If you are from Maryland, even if you're not, you are welcome to use some of the documents or resources that we have here.
Thank you so much for sharing those resources and your experiences. And I think that point of, we change things at the consumer level is hugely important. One last question, and then we'll end right at 2:30, 2:31. There was a lot of discussion about influencing policy and really that born accessibility, and even the comments that transitioning to accessible software after it's built can cost more than building it accessible. DOJ had 2 very successful settlements with CVS and Uber over the past year because of their discrimination based on their software. And I'm wondering how MIDA will engage in education such that companies, large or small, have the knowledge of really the cost savings and associated with born accessible technology.
Great question. So that's one of the aspects of the 2 demonstration projects will be to document how we did it early on, involving the disability rights community, involving the tech companies, but also involving policymakers. And one of our partner groups in government is the U.S. Access Board, who of course is responsible for technical standards related to accessibility, not only ones that are, sort of computer related, but also architectural ones. So yeah, I mean, it's a combination of trying to document how you do it, and also through education, through outreach, putting the word out there. And that can help with, let's say, companies that don't have, large accessibility teams, or companies that have some people, but they're struggling with how do you actually get the organizational change. And that's getting that born accessible approach is part of what the University of Maryland administration was so excited about, which is that, if we have the opportunity to kind of build a community of people who help educate the world and help change the approach of design. And that's really our goal. But part of this is our demonstration projects that we're going to be doing. So Paul or Anna, any further comments you have on that?
No, I don't. Paul?
Yeah, I think you covered that well, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you again to Paul and Anna, and thank you to the entire MIDA team, the 38 faculty on campus, and the graduate students who are going to be joining. Thank you to everyone, and for your support. We start next week. This is exciting. Let's get to work.
Congratulations. This was a great presentation. Thank you very much for your time and your efforts in developing MIDA. Our next presentation is our closing keynote, and we invite everybody to switch over to that link. We'll be setting it up as a webinar. Thank you again.